As Julian Assange said recently, we have to be very skeptical of the traditional media apparatus. And we are. That's why we want to keep bringing you unredacted, uncorporatized news from the front lines, the streets, and inside activist movements. But in order to do that, we need your help. Become a patron of independent media by visiting patreon.com/actout. This week, we're celebrating 100 years of national parks by pushing for more of them. Expert Michael Kellett joins us to talk about the power of national parks and the fight to preserve our wildlands. Plus, some savory snippets from the Green Party convention. But first, a shallow attempt at depth. This whole world view, bereft of breadth, a slick but shallow attempt at depth. Through narrow minds and fearful eyes, we build our castles in the sky and leave the earth to burn. Never taught to learn, we carve our lives from what we earn, then wonder why our souls still yearn for something more than 8 to 4 and 9 to 5, yet on we strive and swallow all the bitter lies that tell us to shut up, comply. Ignore the scores of hollow creeds and stark hypocrisies. Like life is sacred, these right here, but clustered cells in desert hells are better dead because we said so. And so it goes, and on we burn. The earth a shaking head will turn. The only ones to mourn our loss will be the gods and ghosts we made. Through narrow minds and fearful eyes, a whole world view, bereft of breadth, a slick but shallow attempt at depth. The only ones to save our souls are these same souls that yet stay closed to all that we could be, complexly simple humanity. Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. So this week, well, this entire year really, marks the National Park Service centennial anniversary. And while you can get free access to the parks in the final weekend of August and hear some lovely music emanating from the hills and valleys of pristine nature, I'm just sitting here wondering, why the fuck don't we have more national parks? And I'm not the only one, nor by far the first to wonder that. Michael Kellett, executive director of Restore and a national parks expert, has been asking that question for decades. And while he is currently focused specifically on restoring the North Woods in Maine and designating a huge chunk of land to a national park up there, he and his colleagues have a top 100 list that encompasses more than 141 million acres of land across the U.S. For him, designating national parks is a cornerstone of the conservation movement, and indeed one of the easiest and most powerful ways to mitigate the effects of climate change. He points out that conservation biologists estimate that we need to protect about half of the Earth if we are to avoid a 6th great extinction, something that many experts say we're already not avoiding. Meanwhile, national parks encompass a little over 84 million acres, which may sound like a lot, but consider this. Less than 7% of U.S. land is protected within the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which in turn is made up of 6 categories: wilderness, national parks, national monuments, wildlife management areas, protected landscapes, and managed resource areas. So that 7% isn't just national parks, that's all land within any kind of protection, of which national parks are only about 3.8%, if my math serves me correctly. Meanwhile, the Pacific Biodiversity Institute, a respected think tank, identified 657 million acres of wild and roadless land under federal or state ownership, about 29% of the U.S. That's a shit ton of acreage just open and out there without any kind of protection whatsoever. And to be clear, this conservation of nature assumed in the other 5 categories is severely lacking, leaving lands open to the vehement dumbshittedness of mankind. As Michael points out, for example, state forests and national forests generally allow logging, livestock grazing, fracking, road building, off-road motor vehicles, trophy hunting, intensive recreational development, and other destructive uses. National wildlife refuges are typically much better, but they may still allow artificial habitat manipulation and growing row crops to benefit popular game species, trophy hunting of predators, and fracking for oil and gas. So, in other words, the protection offered by anything less than national park status is, well, not that fucking protective. So, why aren't there more national parks? As with most issues that seem to be no-brainers to anyone with common sense and a soul, it's a matter of politics and money. Why designate something as a national park when it could be open for fracking? Although typically the argument sounds a bit more like this: we just don't have the money to do it. Right. Well, here's Michael's rebuttal against that slice of stupidity. Most of the potential parks are already public lands or territorial waters. They would simply need to be transferred for administration under the more protective national park system. Federal public lands, the vast majority, already have budgeted operating funds, which could be transferred with the land. Because much of the resource extraction now happening on these lands is subsidized by us, the taxpayers, we would actually save money, not to mention benefiting ecosystems, wildlife, air and water quality, recreational opportunities, and local economies in the process. State lands can be donated to the National Park Service or traded for other federal lands. Private lands can also be donated, which is how many existing parks were created or acquired by the federal government. But what about the funding the national parks already get that already isn't enough? Well, hold on. Michael will address that as well. But first, he's going to dig deeper into the politics and dirty money of this land, from sea to shining sea. Take a look.
Another thing that pops up a lot is the sale of public lands to fracking and drilling and logging, etc. Do public lands, just in general, talk a little bit about that? Is there any protection on just public land?
Well, it depends on the agency. Each of these agencies, so there's the National Park Service, there's the there's the National Wildlife Refuge System, like the Arctic Refuge in Alaska, that comes under that system. There's the National Forest System, which is under the U.S. Forest Service, which is in the Department of Agriculture, as opposed to the Interior Department. And then the Bureau of Land Management, which is a bunch of land out west, none of it in the east, which is also under the Interior Department. Now, the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service are multiple use agencies, which really means they allow all kinds of stuff, a lot of which is really bad, some of which includes wilderness. So it's this hodgepodge of stuff. And so they feel that they can't turn down logging and mining and grazing and all that's pipelines and wind power and solar, big solar installations. They feel that's a part of their mission, which it sort of is if you read the legislation. So those, just the average National Forest or Bureau of Land Management land, it's certainly better than private land or state land in terms of protection, because there are layers of laws that prevent just total trashing of the land, but they're not nearly as protected as a national park. I mean, I've worked on national forest and Bureau of Land Management issues for years and years and years, and you can't win because the law is open-ended enough, and so you can't, it's not like you can take them to court and win on this. And in the court of public opinion, most people don't even know about what we're talking about. They have no idea. Most people don't even think they log in national forests. They think they're like national parks. So that's why our focus has been, although you have to do defense on these lands, it's a losing battle. You can't win the long-term battle. The best thing to do is to turn over the most important areas to the National Park Service, which doesn't want to log. They don't want to frack. They don't want to drill. They don't want to mine. So you don't have to argue with them about doing it because they don't want to do it. And the laws are much more clear that they need to be preserved and protected.
So in that same vein about the National Park Service not wanting to log and not wanting to frack and things like that, this whole new corporate branding of national parks, it started with the National Park Service selling last year the rights to Budweiser, which clearly violated guidelines on tobacco and alcohol affiliation. But more importantly, it opened the door for the idea of the public good to be tarnished by, bucket loads of corporate money. And now we see that the National Park Service is seeking corporate sponsorship for these quote-unquote park projects.
Right.
Which would, among other things, allow the display of corporate logos in a variety of park settings, sell corporate donor recognition, displays, license park names. And a recent Truth Out article offered up the horrendous idea that the Statue of Liberty might soon be holding a can of Budweiser instead of the torch. So with that in mind, I mean, even though the Park Service hasn't come out and said, like, hey, we want to log and we want to frack, like, if they're asking for all this corporate money, and we know that the reason that these other federal agencies are corrupted is because of corporate money, do you think the National Park Service might eventually turn into the same kind of corrupt federal agency?
Well, I mean, nothing's impossible when you're talking about large amounts of money and political power. The culture of the National Park Service is not beholden to big business generally. This is not happening because the National Park Service director wanted to get into corporate branding and stuff. There's a lot of resistance in the agency to doing this. They're doing it because they're desperate. I think it's a mistake. I think they're misguided in doing this. I think it's a slippery slope. But the reason they're doing it is because right-wing anti-national park and anti-public land members of Congress, in cahoots with big business and so forth, who would like to just privatize national parks altogether, or get rid of them, or both, have strangled the budget of the National Park Service for years. I mean, this has been going on since Ronald Reagan. This has been going on for decades. The problem is, on one hand, you've got the National Park Service being starved for funds, and you've got these political guys bullying the Park Service, including like the chairman of committees in Congress and so forth. On the other hand, who is standing up for the Park Service? Where are all the environmental groups standing up against this stuff? Not much. There's really not much. But the answer is really, we need to build a grassroots support base to keep our national parks protected. It's because they are out there flapping in the wind on their own, trying to deal with these forces. And the big conservation groups around the country aren't doing anything to support the National Park Service. It's unbelievable.
So devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
If there is such a backlog and the National Park Service is already being drained of funds, wouldn't designating more land as national parks only add to this backlog?
Well, number one, the backlog. You have to realize what the backlog is. A good chunk of it is, in fact, most of it is basically roads, bridges, facilities, and whatever. So it's not like the Grand Canyon is going to cave in if we don't fund the backlog. I mean, the reason we create national parks is to protect the land, the wildlife, the scenic beauty, make it available to the public. You don't need a bunch of infrastructure to do that. Most of the infrastructure is in the old parks like Yellowstone, Yosemite. Now, some of it is historic structures, and that does take money, and that's the worst thing, is because obviously we don't want important historic structures to be caving in and stuff because of a lack of money. So I'm not poo-pooing it as not an issue, but it's not like the parks themselves, like the wildlife are going to starve or something because they're, And number two, you're not talking about a lot of money. $12 billion? I mean, this is chicken feed. Each year we spend $50 billion on the B-35 Joint Strike, or F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, which is a Cold War worthless boondoggle project. It's going to go on and on, year after year after year, $50 billion for this useless fighter plane. So, I mean, if the Congress wanted to, in 1 year, they could fund the whole thing and take care of it. The whole budget of the National Park Service annual budget is like 0.1% of the federal budget. It's nothing. We could double it, triple it, it would still be hardly anything. So it's not that it's not an issue, it's that money flows to political power. There's no political pressure to make sure and fund the National Park Service. And there could be. I mean, what I've said to people is you got 300 million people visiting each year to national parks. What if 1% of those people were organized and pushing back and pushing to fund the National Park Service, to expand our national parks, to take care of these problems? It would get done.
So with regards to the to the importance of national parks. Like you've mentioned that environmentalists haven't really taken this up as a fight of theirs. Explain why you feel, and you wrote in an article as well, that you feel that national parks, designating more land as national parks, is a quote-unquote gold standard for conservation. Why do you feel that is that way?
Right. Well, because there's no other kind of land management entity that's protected so much land for so long. You've got Yellowstone National Park, which was created in 1872. There's no other 2.2 million acre tract of land on the planet that's been protected for that long for the public. Now, they've made some mistakes, and years ago they killed off the wolves in Yellowstone, but that was the prevailing ignorant mentality then amongst even the over-professionals. They realized later that that was a huge mistake and reintroduced wolves. The only reason that could be done is because Yellowstone was still intact over 100 years later. So number one, the national parks have a track record of protecting these lands for decades and decades, over 100 years in many cases. And number two, people know about national parks, so you have a much better chance of rallying the public against bad things which they inevitably will try to do. Like the Arctic Refuge, National Wildlife Refuges, we're still worrying about possibly drilling for oil there. If that were a national park, that would not even be an issue. It would be gone. So it really ought to be transferred to the National Park Service. That would be the best way to protect it.
So once again, the "we can't afford it" argument completely falls apart. And even outside of the points that Michael mentioned, consider the amount of money to be saved from conservation. Whether that be leaving trees to suck up carbon or stop mudslides before they even start, it's difficult, maybe even impossible, to calculate the money and indeed lives we could save through this type of common sense conservation, particularly as we continue to deal with more and more extreme weather patterns and events. And as Michael said, if just 1% of those 300 million national park visitors stood up for more, we'd have one hell of a movement. So with that in mind, go enjoy a national park this weekend. And next, celebrate 100 years of common sense conservation and raise a fist for 100 more. Also, to learn more about Michael's work with Restore, check out restore.org. Moving on, a couple of weeks ago, we brought you the street view from the DNC, and although we weren't able to make it to the Green Party convention in Houston, we feel it's only fair to give you a quick rundown of what happened there, as well as a brief overview of the Green Party VP candidate. So, first of all, it's probably not surprising that Jill Stein won the Green Party nomination. If you watched our coverage of the DNC protests, you noticed that she was very active and very vocal, appealing to the Bernie or busters who refused to see Hillary as their bust option. And on that same note, Stein tipped the proverbial hat to Bernie Sanders again during her acceptance speech.
It is such an honor to be also running in alliance with the Bernie Sanders movement that I now get called as Burning Green. Burning Green, we are burning green together. We owe you such a debt of gratitude for lifting up this revolution that has been smoldering for decades. You broke through the media blackout. You lifted us up, and you refused to be shut down by the DNC.
She went on to talk a lot about the grave and serious issues facing both people and planet, from police brutality to rising sea levels. And she made a strong point of calling out all those who suggest that voting for the lesser evil will somehow save us from evil, focusing on the power of the people should we choose to use it.
We are the ones we've been waiting for when they tell us to, get out of the way because we're standing in the way of the lesser evil. The answer to that is that this politics of fear, which we've been told to bow down to, has only delivered everything we were afraid of. All those reasons. We were told to vote for the lesser evil because we didn't want the offshoring of our jobs, the meltdown of the climate, the massive bailouts for Wall Street, the expanding prison state, away the attack on our civil liberties and on immigrant rights. All those things we didn't want is exactly what we got by allowing ourselves to be silenced and letting a lesser evil speak for us. Remember, when they try to tell you you are powerless, remember what Alice Walker says. The biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We have it. We are going to use it in this election. We are saying no to the lesser evil and yes to the greater good.
And finally, she called out the Democrats for being squarely part of the problem rather than a party for the people, and placed Trump in the larger lens of the sharp rise in right-wing extremism worldwide, and Hillary as a furtherance of dangerous ideas and actions rather than a mitigating solution.
We have a crisis in nuclear weapons, and again, thanks very much to the Democrats. Bill Clinton, who removed us from the anti-ballistic missile treaty framework for nuclear disarmament, and then Barack Obama, who created a $1 trillion budget for us to spend on a new generation of nuclear weapons and modes of delivery. So on the count of climate, on the count of nuclear weapons, and this insane nuclear arms race that we are once again headlong plunging into, and on account of these endless and expanding wars that are blowing back at us all around the world. We cannot afford to sit this one out. The lesser evil is a losing strategy because people stop coming out to vote for lesser evil politicians throwing them under the bus. So the Republicans will win anyhow. And to look at Donald Trump does not stand alone. Donald Trump is about the rise of right-wing extremism, not only in this country, but in Europe. And as Bernie Sanders himself so often said, the only solution to the likes of Donald Trump is a truly radical, progressive agenda that restores our needs and ends the economic misery that promotes the kinds of demagogues we are seeing in Donald Trump. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Hillary Clinton is the problem. She is not the solution to Donald Trump. We are the solution. We are the ones we've been waiting for. This is our moment. Together we do have the power to create an America and a world that works for all of us. The power to create that world is not just in our hopes, it's not just in our dreams, right here and now, it's in our hands. We will make this happen together. We are unstoppable.
If you want to hear more from Jill Stein, she'll be appearing on CNN. I know, shocking. But one of the corporate shit stains on the name of journalism apparently cleaned up their act just enough to see the point in giving a platform to a presidential candidate. So, tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern on CNN, Jill Stein will appear in a town hall event. So be sure to tune into that if you want to get more of a scoop on her and her platform. As for other convention highlights, if you follow us on Facebook, you may have noticed our post on Julian Assange, who joined the convention via satellite and had this to say about the Democrat and Republican candidates. Quote, "You're asking me if I prefer cholera or gonorrhea." Well, that certainly is succinct. He also shared his thoughts on free speech, building movements, and the power of alternative media in the face of corporatized, propagandized media. Also in the program, Dr. Cornel West gave one hell of a fiery speech about truth, justice, integrity, and taking a fucking stand.
And at this particular historical moment, let us be not deceived. The American empire is in deep decay. Capitalist civilization is in deep decline. It needs radical, revolutionary democratizing from the bottom up. The indifference to evil is more evil than evil itself. Turning your back on folks suffering, turning your back on poor people, turning your back on working people, turning your back on folk in Central America and Honduras as if somehow that's just a side issue. turning your back on the Israeli occupation just because AIPAC has so much money. We don't care about money. We want the truth. We want to keep track of the humanity of everybody, no matter who they are. No matter who they are. Oh, yes. And if there were a Palestinian occupation of our precious Jewish brothers and sisters, we would be just as morally outraged. We want to do something right and moral and just. That's why we are here. That's why we're going to make history. That this political extortion with this symbolic gun at your head, if you don't vote for one party as opposed to the other party, you're responsible for the catastrophe. We understand the difference between a neo-fascist catastrophe and a neoliberal disaster. We understand the difference, but we still decide to go with what the Green Party is putting forward. And for me, it's going to be Sister Jill and Brother Baraka.
Well, hot damn, that's inspiring. And by the by, the Baraka he's talking about is Ajamu Baraka, the VP Green Party candidate. Baraka is a world-renowned human rights activist, organizer, and geopolitical analyst. As Counterpunch reported, his activist track record includes being founding executive director of the U.S. Human Rights Network and coordinator of the U.S.-based Black Left Unity Network's Committee on International Affairs. Baraka has served on the boards of various national and international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and the National Center for Human Rights Education. He has served on the boards of the Center for Constitutional Rights, Africa Action, Latin American Caribbean Community Center, Diaspora Afrique, and the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights. He is also a member of the Green Shadow Cabinet and an associate fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. And now he can add vice presidential candidate to that track record. So for more on Jill's campaign, visit Jill2016.com, and that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please do spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people you don't know. As always, check out the last slide to see the sites that I mentioned in this week's show, and be sure to follow us on Twitter and like us on Facebook and subscribe on YouTube to make sure that you never miss an update. Until next week, good night and act out.
And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, donate at Occupy.com/donate. If you'd like to donate directly to Act Out, visit Patreon.com/actout.